welcome to episode 4 of Wrestling with Poetry. This is a podcast about pro wrestling as well as poetry, and this week the great poet Mary Hickman will be on, and our topic is the origin of American professional wrestling. Pro wrestling is derived from Greco-Roman wrestling. The Greeks wrestled nude. Not so in other places. The ancient Egyptians also wrestled, but they weren't as naked. There's also been wrestling in the deep past in China. It's called Shui Jua. It's a Chinese wrestling style that originated over 4,000 years ago. Sumo wrestling is said to have begun as a ritual dance to ensure a good harvest. They know this because of prehistoric art. But the pro wrestling we know of today is a blend of rhetoric, archetype, and fighting. It began in the circus. The person credited with making it a thing is Jean Exbrayat, and this happened around 1848 in France. They would have a proficient wrestler like Bonnet, the ox of the Low Alps, and he would be tasked with wrestling whoever wanted to wrestle him, or they would have wrestlers to fight him. That sort of wrestler is called a jobber, and they are paid to lose. Okay, with the use of jobbers to elevate the wrestler, you can see that there was not perfect adherence to the classical rules of wrestling. It started to go slack here. And this new loose style of wrestling is called catch wrestling, which is short for catch as catch can. The first world championship wrestler, that was 1905, because that was the first world championship, and that's where they introduced the big belt. And the winner was George Hackenschmidt, and people loved him. He would be defeated by the American Iowan Frank Gotch. People really loved him. You can see footage of people slobbering over pictures of Frank Gotch online. Anyway, Frank Gotch retired and the sport lost a lot of its fans. At least on the coast they did. It retained its popularity in the Middle West. Now, women would begin wrestling in the 1930s and the 1940s. Before then, it was illegal, or it was in the domain of the sideshow. It was perilous for women to wrestle because their only promoter was a guy named Billy Wolf, and he pressured the women into having sex with other promoters. He was awful. He was married to Mildred Burke, the famous wrestler champion. I mentioned two of these early women wrestlers in episode 2, and that would be Mildred Burke and Mae Young, the great Mae Young. They both wrestled in the 40s. Mildred was a longtime champion. As I said, she was married to the creep Billy Wolf. Mae Young would eventually defeat the woman who defeated Mildred, who is June Byers. In the 50s, two pioneering black women wrestlers were Babs Wingo and her sister Ethel Johnson. They integrated women's wrestling, a very big deal. The 50s saw interest return to pro wrestling, and this is because of the new technology of TV. From 1948 to 1955, all the major TV stations had wrestling shows, and the personality who really sold it was Gorgeous George. He was a flamboyant heel wrestler who is accompanied by his valet Jeffries. And I'm not going to talk too much about him because but people did love to hate him. And I'm going to have a future episode devoted entirely to Gorgeous George. But I will tell you that Muhammad Ali and James Brown were very influenced by Gorgeous George's style. That's not bad. Institutionally, this is how it went. All the many wrestling associations were absorbed into an outfit called NWA, National Wrestling Alliance, which would then become AWA, American Wrestling Association. And then Capital Wrestling Corporation, which was within that association, they would break off and become WWWF, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which would become World Wrestling Federation, which would become World Wrestling Entertainment, the promotion company we all know run by Vince McMahon. And that brings us up to 2023, loosely. I don't want to bore you with too many details. Now it's time for questions. Here's a question. Dear wrestlers, I was fascinated by Robert's suggestion that Jack Spicer might be the so-called heel of poetry, the provocateur, with perhaps a secret heart of gold, who sacrifices peace and goodwill for the sake of an interesting game. I wonder if Ezra Pound might be considered one of the faces of poetry, that is, a poet who created public cohesion and narrative, who turned out, like notable face Hulk Hogan, to have a cynical heart of coal. What other poetic faces do you think are worth mentioning? No, I could see that Jack Spicer might have been a secret face. He might have just been playing the heel and being as heel as he could be so that when he became face it would be even more dramatic. Unfortunately, he died before he could make that public explosion. Alright, so what other poetic faces do you think are worthy of mentioning? Thanks for the podcast. Sincerely, Ted from Kentucky. Ted. Dear Ted, it goes without saying that everyone who has been on my show is a worthy face poet, namely Greg Purcell, Ryan Ecke, Stella Corso, and Mary Hickman. But there are other living poetry faces, and I've got like a rough list. Please, send me your ideas of faces, listeners. wrestlingwithpoetry@gmail.com. I will mention whatever poetry face you want. Or if you want to out a heel, go ahead. Tell me. I'll say it on the podcast. I don't care. But these are but now to go back to the topic. Who do I consider poetry faces? I think Raoul Zurita, Toby Altman, Hannah Brooks Model, Eddie Berrigan, Trapita Mason, Arda Collins, and Robert Fernandez. Those are some of my favorite poetry faces. And here's some Hall of Famer poetry faces: Mary Oliver, Lucille Clifton, Robert Hayden, Jackson McLough, John Giorno, and Anna Mendelsohn. Those are some of my faves in the Hall of Fame. And now for the reading. Mary Hickman is a poet and performer living in Lincoln, Nebraska with her two favorite beings, the poet and artist Robert Fernandez and the escape artist and wanderer extraordinaire Spicy Cat.
I feel wonderful today. What is it? A thin membrane of oil, even blue silence sought by everyone. Suddenly it splits, my only thought, balanced like a dying leaf on the back of my hand. Hot soybeans pop in the pan. Hello, ghosts. I am your host. I like your voices, like women and poets, your burning lives. The cat speaks. I feel wonderful today. Born female, when I approach the mirror, I let my lips approach the mirror and it blurs and I see beyond my sight. Where do you find yourself? A little fried, near where the men lie down in the streets. They had success in working into death. Oh, I want to blush like a boiled crab. Do you mean to say my right foot has no joint? No, I mean to shout. Let the dancers out. But the ritual refuses to start. I was born female, descended from flies. I was born with the wheel of bondage on both arms. Did you ever wish to become a frozen will following its own track? A bird stripping the fruit tree? I did. Last week, an 18-year-old girl was raped at the end of my block. I keep watch. I record each face in a book. I had only just learned the names of trees. The town goes silent. The piano teacher walks each night. No fatigue or tenderness, but the knife is like a bitter dream. Last week I said, this is the prettiest part of the path. Catalpa tree, cottonwood, oak where the bark gives up in the heavy rains. White roses of the catalpa she tried to braid into her hair, both shoulders that fall from the pillow.
Thank you, Mary. That was amazing. Events. Poetry reading. There will be a poetry reading, Writing Across Boundaries with Gail Griffin. That will be at BookBug. This is a bookstore, 6:30 p.m., Tuesday, June 13th. That's tomorrow. There will be an open mic every Thursday at Satellite Records from 5:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. That is located on 808 Southwest Edge in Kalamazoo. There will be wrestling. Independent pro wrestling will be at Gull Lake Motors. The event is called Overkill, and it is at 12312 E.D. Avenue in Richland, Michigan. It will be Saturday, June 17th, 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. That is all for now. I hope you have a great week. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.